I'm Mina Malik Hussain, and this is The Coffee Table. And today I'm really excited because we have such an important show for you guys today, and it's going to be so much fun, and it's also going to be something really serious and something that it's a very complicated conversation, but I also feel like at the heart of it, it's also something that's not that difficult to understand. So today on the show, we're going to be talking about consent. And what does it mean? What does consent mean? I think there are a lot of differing opinions about this. There are a lot of opinions about consent. So who better than two lawyers to join us on the show today to unpack what consent is, what does it mean to obtain it, and what does it mean as an individual to be mindful of your own consent to things and the different shapes that it can take. And I'm so excited to be welcoming on the show today Angbeen Atif Mirza, who is an assistant professor of law at the Sheikh Ahmed Hassan School of Law at the Lahore University of Management Science. She is also the faculty director for the LUMS Office of Accessibility and Inclusion, and also sits on the board of the Digital Rights Foundation. We are also joined by Ms. Hiba Akbar, who is a teaching fellow also at the Sheikh Ahmed Hassan School of Law at LUMS, where she teaches criminal and constitutional law. Hiba has a Master's of Law from Columbia University, where she went there on the Fulbright Scholarship. Much brilliance abounding on the set today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I'm so excited always to have actual people on set. Must be. But I'm also really excited to be talking about consent, because I think that it's really complicated and it takes many shapes, and I think that's why it becomes confusing for many people to sort of understand that what is it, when do you need it. I feel like you need it all the time, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So if we sort of begin at the beginning, Angbeen, so when we talk about consent, to use generally in general terms, like what are we talking about?
So consent is a very, very broad concept, and I think it manifests itself in different ways in different areas of the law as well. So like we were talking earlier, if you're talking about contract law, corporate law, consent has a slightly different connotation, different meaning.
Right.
But if we come into human interaction, or let's say a joint endeavor for whatever, consent would be agreement between parties, which I would like to say is expressly given by all parties involved. So that would be the most basic generic definition of consent, which then in certain circumstances will lead into complications. But I think if it's a beginning point, consent is agreement which is freely given, it is ongoing, it is expressed.
It's fries, I wrote it down.
Okay, yeah. So,
it's reversible.
Yes.
It's informed.
Yes.
And in many situations, it should be specific and enthusiastic as well.
Which also goes to the fact that you need to be mentally aware of the consent that you are giving. So if it's enthusiastic and specific, then you know exactly what you are consenting to. So consent, which is obtained by misrepresentation or misinformation, or consent which is manipulated, or consent
or coerced.
Which is coerced, or also obtained when you are not entirely in your senses, or in an adult or of sane mind, etc. This is not consent because it's not valid. It's not actual informed consent.
That's really, really important, I think.
And so I think what ties together a lot of this is the fact that consent has to be informed and it has to be deliberate. So which is why, legally speaking, children cannot consent.
Right.
People going through debilitating mental illnesses cannot consent, irrespective of the area of law you're talking about. A child cannot buy a car, for example, because a child is not capable of consent. In the same way, a child is not capable of giving consent in other areas of law. And that's an idea you just keep building on based on the context.
So why do we have an age of consent then? So because I know that we have a legal definition of who is a child, who is a minor, who is not a competent person. But then why is it important to have those benchmarks?
It just has to do with your awareness of the world as a child, isn't it? A child cannot protect themselves, cannot make an informed decision about what is the best course of action for them. They are easily coerced. They are easy to put under duress.
Yes.
So that's why children aren't allowed to do that. A young adult, an adolescent, your understanding of their awareness and being able to decide what's best for them is also evolving. And I think, legally speaking, again, I slip into the legal because I'm a lawyer. People have a really hard time thinking, but what do you mean? The night before my 18th birthday, I can't consent, I can't understand, but suddenly I turn 18 and I can understand the
world. It's like this invisible line in the sand that,
which definitely, socially, definitely it's difficult to understand, but legally you have to draw the line somewhere. So that's a reality. That's where the law decides to draw that line over there. But it's a legal enunciation of a concept we all live by. You will not go into an agreement with a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old, a 16-year-old, but you're going to look for someone who's mature. We always ask a kid, "Beta, me se baat kara do," for this very reason.
Yes. Is there a grown-up somewhere? But I think that the root of that, for me at least, in my own sort of layperson understanding, is that consent that is obtained through manipulation or coercion or misrepresentation is not consent. Therefore, it's inadmissible. Therefore, it doesn't count. So you can't say that, that a 16-year-old is generally quite mature, and they might be. But that's why you have to have that legal sort of, that line whereby you can say that, well, fine, you could be the most mature 16 or 17-year-old in the universe, but it's still not consent.
Yes.
Exactly.
And so that's why the law will lay down different lines. Right? So, I guess the problem in our law is that we have different kind of lines laid down for different types of consent. So, right?
So first, let's talk about different kinds of consent. Because a lot of times when people think consent, they're always thinking about it in terms of relationships, for example, or sort of, sexual interaction and things. But there are lots of different kinds of arenas where consent is quite relevant. So yes, carry on.
So in terms of carrying on from what Hiba said, the law recognizes, and in that sense, the law is, you can call it parental at some level, right? Because it's not vesting you with the responsibility of taking responsibility for your actions till you attain a certain age. So you can't commit a criminal offense if you are under 12. You can't, and if you are under 18, you are considered to be a juvenile, and treatment for you is very different. It's more rehabilitative. It's not, it's not punishment, etc. In the same vein, it comes to when you come to marriage. So globally, of course, there are laws which say that you can't marry unless you are 18, because again, you are not equipped to give consent for sexual relations. And there are biological considerations to this. Your body is not ready to carry a child. You are going to end up with all those maternal issues that I'm sure,
I have spoken about ad nauseum on this show.
Yes, and so there are real reasons, and it's not just this, agenda to make women kind of more independent or whatever it is that is the argument against having that age. And so in Punjab, for instance, right now, if I'm not mistaken, it's the age of marriage for girls is 16.
Yes.
And so moving on from that concept, a criminal law concept is statutory rape.
Right.
So if you are under the age where you can give consent, and you have sexual relations, your consent doesn't matter because the law doesn't recognize it. You are incapable of giving consent because you are a minor. And therefore, it is statutory rape. However enthusiastically you might have consented.
It's just not okay. And I think that the issue of responsibility is a really important one here, because then the older person in that situation is the one who's then going to be held accountable, or should be at least.
And is
held accountable. Or sort of legally is held accountable.
Because let's face it, it's just something uncomfortable here. Who are the people who we think are certainly more mature or who grow up very mature? Those are going to be people who are lower class. Globally, if we're talking, that's a bias against black people as well, that somehow they mature more fully. This is someone...
Or that hardship makes you more worldly and more sort of able to deal with things.
Exactly.
Which is not true.
Which is not true. And these are biases and these are dangerous ideas, and we need to think about where these dangerous ideas are coming from. What does it say? My child can take all the time in the world to grow up and become mature, but someone who's had not a privileged upbringing, they're suddenly assumed to be more mature. And this is such a weird two sides of the coin thing when it comes to women, because they're at once not mature enough to handle the responsibilities of the world and go to a government office, sign a document because she doesn't understand the world. But at the same time, she's mature enough to bear a child, marry, give sexual consent. So she's both immature as well as too mature.
Exactly.
So she's taking the negative on both. Basically, the burden is all borne by the woman.
Because you're being infantilized where it suits society, and then you're also being thrust into some super ultra mature category when it suits.
When it's convenient.
And then I suppose that's where then consent becomes important, because if as an individual you are aware that A, you have certain rights, and B, you have the legal right or protections to say no or to resist or to sort of affirm your bodily autonomy, then that's where consent becomes important. And then knowing about what it means to consent to something, where again it comes back to being informed about the thing. So, but before we sort of, go further there, because that's basically what I want to talk all about. I want to go back to what we were previously speaking about different kinds of consent in different situations. So I know that there is, for example, consent in a medical context, or there's consent in transactions, and that's also
or sports.
Or sports, exactly, where that's implied consent. So what's implied consent, Angbeen? Isn't it like a test?
I know, right?
You go. This is not an MCQ.
So implied consent is where by your behavior and kind of non-verbal cues, you have indicated to the person that you are consenting to that you agree to engage in certain behavior. I'd like to argue that for sexual interaction, implied consent should not be consent.
Yes.
But if we were to move to, let's say, sports, let's say if I'm playing football with somebody and I get kicked in the shin and I get hurt really badly, the possibility of being kicked in the shin was something that I impliedly consented to when I got onto the foot. I put on my whatever.
When you agreed to be in the game,
Yeah.
then you were also tacitly agreeing that if somebody kicks me in the shin or something hits me on the head, then that's just like an assumption.
A reasonable risk associated with the game of football.
Yes.
Or when I engage in kind of, extreme sports, like if I'm going rock climbing or whatever, though they make you sign all those consent forms, right? Because there's a lot of responsibility associated with taking people up onto a rock face.
Yes.
And that's, you can't impliedly consent to the dangers, you have to sign something. So then I guess the idea is the more serious the harm, the more important it is to get express consent, like medical consent.
But Hiba, isn't it also tricky because let's say you're in a situation where there is implied consent, like a football game, or you get into a car with someone to go somewhere. But then doesn't it also sort of that about being an informed choice? What if it's not very clear to you, like your assumption is a faulty one? Like you think someone's a good driver and that it's safe to go with them, but it turns out that they are terrible drivers. They don't have a license, or they were drunk or something. So what happens then?
So yeah, that's a very interesting situation actually, and not something I thought about in a great deal. Because here I was thinking, but they have a license, so they're legally allowed to. But you're like, oh, maybe what if they don't?
What if
they're just really irresponsible? But that becomes part of the implied consent, the implied risk you're deciding to take on. Because technically speaking, driving, for example, is a dangerous activity. It's an everyday activity, but it is very dangerous. It requires a lot of mental maturity, presence of mind, etc. Sports, in a similar way, are inherently dangerous, but they're dangerous because humans decide to call them for fun.
Or like if you don't know that the team you're playing against is particularly vicious, and they're the sort of team who likes to mow down people and stomp on them.
I think the key there is to think of it as implied consent, not for a super duper precise activity, but for a range of activities that it encompasses. So for example, you might be a very responsible driver, but the other person on the road is being absolutely reckless. That's just a risk that you assume to take on once you indulge in this activity.
Okay, we're going to take a very quick break at this juncture. I will keep on nattering, but after a very quick break. Stay with us. We'll be back in a flash. Welcome back to the coffee table, where we are having an astoundingly important conversation about consent with lawyers extraordinaire Angbeen, Atif Mirza and Hiba Akbar, who are both teachers of law at the Sheikh Ahmed Hassan School of Law at LUMS. Say the whole thing, sort of give you guys that due importance. Just be like, there. So before the break, we were talking about different sort of forms and shapes that consent takes, and implied consent is one of them. But I think, and like you said, in sort of right at the beginning of the show, that consent needs to be expressly given. Like it has to be very clear that this is a very clear yes. So I think that previously there was this idea about how no means no, and that was a sort of fairly clear and easy way to understand that. But then I think that that's been modified to yes means yes, which is even clearer and a much more affirmative, sort of stance to take, or a certain very affirmative kind of consent to give. So what need was that clarification addressing?
So I think that the idea of no means no puts the entire onus on let's say, the victim. Let's just call the person the victim because they feel like consent was not given. And that onus is unfair because somebody else is taking the action which is being consented to, right? So So like we talk in law about how the burden of proof is on the person who's trying to prove a point.
Yes.
You know, our teachers always used to tell us, I'm the one saying there's a fly in this room and you're the one saying there's not. Then obviously the burden of proof is on me to say, there it is, as opposed to you saying, it's not there, it's not there, it's not, right? So similarly, if there's somebody saying there was consent, the onus should be on the person who is basing the argument on the presence of consent rather than the other person saying, no, but I said no, right? And then taking that a step further, and the reason this becomes important is because a lot of times consent is manipulated, consent is coerced, there is a power dynamic between parties, there is a safety concern. Sometimes women, you know, like we've heard this argument, women go into bodies go into shock, not women, victims of all types go into shock and you can't say anything. So you obviously don't say no, but there's a reason, and many times the perpetrators will know, or sometimes they might not even know, right? If we give everybody the benefit of doubt, there could be a situation where party A thinks there is consent in this silence, but party B is in a state of shock.
Right.
And so who is to decide later? It becomes, and so coming to that, it becomes very hard to decide later because it's a he said, she said, or she said, whatever. It's between A versus B. And then finally, there's the issue of consent, which is obtained when a person is not completely in their senses for whatever reason. For being drunk or drugged, or realities that we don't talk about in this country, but they do exist all over the world. And then that is used against the victim to say that, because then that's something that they can't raise, right? Because it's a taboo thing to say that, oh, actually, I was kind of, the word is not coming to me, but basically I'm not in my senses entirely. But then they'll be like, Acha, so why were you? Why were you in that situation?
Yes.
And then it's your fault. Just like, what were you wearing? It's your fault. So when you start doing those things, it becomes, I mean, that's a longer conversation, but for now, just to say that that's why yes is yes is much more accurate as a description of consent than no means no.
So Hiba, does that also mean that then consent is a two-way street, where it's not just the, you know, for ease of clarity, victim saying yes or no, but it's also the person who's carrying out the action has to respect that as well. So even if, for example, somebody keeps saying no, but the other person just keeps on going, because there's also a lot of sort of cultural baggage there also, where that, well, actually, yes means yes, but no also means yes sometimes. And it's that sort of bro culture where you're like, no, no. And it's also this thing where women aren't supposed to, don't feel comfortable freely expressing a yes. The saying yes in itself is such a problem, that you say no, but you actually mean yes. But these are all, I want to say ridiculous, and I have, because, but going back to the original question, that this is also like a big problem, that if somebody is ignoring your no, what do you do?
Definitely, Mina. I think, you know, you've put it brilliantly. Ignoring a no is violation of consent. You could be saying no in the best of terms, but the other person, if they don't respect that and they chose to ignore that, they chose to override that, that is on them. So this is both your ability, you mustering up, quite frankly, the strength and the courage to say no, to, you know, say it in the most clearest terms, or however you feel comfortable saying no, but the other person having to respect it as well. And then that is also, that's not always a black and white situation. There's a question of sensitivity there as well. Angbeen spoke about, you know, how often there is a power relation in a situation, but the person might not be aware of that. So right now, for example, this is your job, this is your show, I'm on here for the first time, I'm figuring things out. The power relation is bent in your favor at this moment. If on top of this you were a man, or you were much older, or I might not be speaking the best English, the power relationship would be tipped in your favor to a much larger degree, right? So those are all things that govern how a situation pans out. So for example, with someone I work with who is my superior, the best way I could say no would just be to, no, I don't think that's a good idea. That's not super firm, but it is clear. And it is on then the other person to pay attention to these cues. Read the fact that I'm uncomfortable, that I'm saying no as best as I can under the circumstances.
Absolutely. And also this is sort of, this is made worse by the fact that because there is generally, and globally, again, this is not just, oh, this happens in this country, that while women fear violence so much, because it happens to us all the time, that a lot of times that kind of example of no that you just said is the best we can do in most circumstances.
And it's not violence. I also want to say it's just uncomfortableness.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want to be that person who upsets the entire dinner party because you talked about this uncomfortable truth, or you won't shout at someone at a dinner party at the workplace saying, back off.
Yeah.
You will only try to keep things as peaceful as possible, as comfortable as possible, but also express what you're saying.
And try to fade into the background. And another thing that I want to say about what Hiba was saying is this. There's this cheap romanticization of the idea of a woman saying no but meaning yes, and we have grown up on it.
Yes.
And so, and like you said, it's a global thing. And when you were talking, I was reminded of, how in Pride and Prejudice, that Mr. Colin comes and says, oh, but you are, you must marry me. And Elizabeth says, no. And he says, no, but it is the charm of women that they always say no first. And then, and that's like, it's a globally revered book, right? And and at the end, she just had to be like, God, what am I going to say to make you understand?
Should I have to throw you out the window?
Make you understand that no means no. And on the flip side, look at every single Bollywood movie that we grew up on in the 90s is basically this idea that this boy is going to hound you and hound you and hound you till the woman finally switches from somehow being annoyed to being charmed, yes,
by your aggressive stalking.
Exactly. And all these, look at all the Shah Rukh Khan movies that you've seen, and we all grew up on Shah Rukh Khan, right? And that is the average like all of ours idea of what it means to be wooed by someone.
Yes.
That's romantic love for you, and it's basically harassment.
Yes.
That is harassment. That's regularized sort of
definition of
harassment with a bow on it, to make it more palatable.
It's incredibly important to recognize this reality.
Objectification.
Exactly. And it is objectification because if you do not recognize the autonomy of the other person and you refuse to accept that they're a person with opinions and feelings and likes and dislikes.
And the ability to make up their mind.
Yes.
Right? That's the thing. Like, women just don't know their mind. Therefore, she's saying no, but actually she really wants it. Therefore, the whole idea that what she wears is going to tell me, man, or, a perpetrator, what she's asking for. She's asking for it is this idea that it's okay for me to objectify this human being.
And I will decide what cues you are giving.
Yes.
In spite of the fact that I have nothing to do with you.
And which is why that then becomes a slippery slope, right?
Yes. So much evidence to show that assault and ignoring consent is all about power.
Yes.
And it's all about you do it because you can.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so even this conversation, starting this conversation about the fact that she was wearing something is very problematic because it, like the internet has shown us in the previous days, it ignores the children, the men, the dead, the animals, the men.
Yes.
So it ignores all of that. So what is it saying? Why are you placing the blame of this entire social power dynamic?
No, and it's also erasing other people to whom this happens. And I think a lot of times these conversations about consent, we're always talking about girls and we're talking about what girls need to do to protect themselves, but we never talk about the boys either. And boys are equally vulnerable, and as we know very well that all of this is applicable to everybody, but then it only comes down to that power differential. Now, one thing that we sort of briefly touched on.
So can I just jump in here? Yes. So there's two things that lead on from there. So number one, you spoke about how rape or sexual abuse is about power, right? And there's this idea out there that, unfortunately, in my interactions with the state, I find a lot of state officials falling into this trap as well, of thinking that rape occurs because of pent-up sexual energy and because of lust. That's not the case, because we're perfectly capable of controlling our lust when we're fasting, when we're around people we should not be sexually attracted to. But suddenly when someone with less power, someone who can't resist, someone who is tied up by sexual mores is in the presence of a perpetrator, they're the ones they single out to attack.
Yes.
With children, it's often preceded by a lot of grooming and making them feel powerless so that their inability to say no or report it is constrained.
And that manipulated consent.
Yes. That is manipulated consent.
With the child who's incapable of
Which is why, as a lawyer, I mean, I've researched the law in and out, but I have to say that how you prevent sexual assault is not by passing laws. Strict laws, no matter how strict the punishment is, the punishment only comes after the fact. Once an incident has occurred and someone is saddled with physical and mental trauma for the rest of their lives, it always has to be preventive. And it is preventive by changing this cultural conversation and the social mores around issues of consent and bodily autonomy.
Absolutely. I think that is just
spot on.
Fantastic. Spot on.
Yes.
It's a delight to have lawyers on the show. Going to take a very quick break. We'll be back in 1 second. Stay with us. Welcome back to the coffee table, where we have been having a wonderful conversation about consent and the many intricacies around the idea of it. And I'm just having a wonderful time with lawyers Angbeen, Atif, Mirza, and Hiba, Akbar from the Sheikh Ahmed Hassan School of Law, where they're doing wonderful things, where they teach, but they also work with students. And I think that that's probably like you're sort of, both of you are really in the thick of things, because a lot of times when, and I know, Angbeen, that you deal with this a lot because with your work with the Office of Accessibility and Inclusion, I don't want to get it wrong, is that we're talking about safety for young people.
Yeah.
And that's where consent, for me at least, falls into that category, where you're trying to when we do awareness building and we raise awareness, then we are hopefully also equipping young people to identify situations that are dangerous and then also know what to do about it. Because a lot of times, and even when you're older, you know, that whole idea that, oh, well, if somebody made you uncomfortable, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you slap them? Why didn't you leave? And like we've been talking about this, that there are power differentials, there you freeze, you don't know what to do, you feel scared.
Yes.
And that happens to men and women.
So much. Yeah.
You know, it's not just that girls froze, boys can do freeze.
Yes.
And anybody can feel scared. That's a perfectly normal human situation. So do you feel like that is something that you've had to sort of deal with, where people are like, well, if you talk about consent, then aren't you encouraging kids to do dodgy things?
Yes, yes. So when you make a policy, right, and you define something, you obviously define it in, sometimes you end up defining things in contradiction to other things, right?
Yeah.
So what is harassment? Harassment includes multiple things, but it also includes non-consensual behavior.
Behavior,
right?
Huh.
So when you're saying non-consensual behavior, the question sometimes does come up, surprisingly so, that, you know, if you're saying non-consensual behavior is harassment, then are you impliedly also saying something about consensual behavior? And no, we're not. We're just saying that when you are now our students are adults, right? They're 18 when they come to university. And now suddenly they are exposed to a world that they have not been exposed to so far.
Absolutely.
And they are not equipped, because our schools, our educational systems, they don't equip our young children with the knowledge or awareness of how to exercise agency over their bodies.
Yes.
Right? So if something happens, and usually it happens when you are a child,
Yeah.
Where you also lack that voice and that confidence. And somehow when you grow up as an adult, it's not a magical thing that you get.
Yes.
You know, so you need to be equipped with it. So as an institution, we are trying to now develop modules where all students, it's not a women thing, it's not a vulnerable group thing, every single person needs to know what consent is, how is it given, how is it received,
Yes.
and what is the line that you must draw and you have to respect if you want to be a responsible adult at a university.
And I think that what you said about bodily autonomy is really important, because that's something that we don't teach our kids also. And I feel like now the conversation is slightly better about, let's say, good touch, bad touch, for example. But that's not consent, really. That's more about being able to identify what's bad behavior. But we are still not talking about your right to say no, and the idea of your body as something that you own. Like, it belongs to you. And we often throw our children into situations where they go and hug X, or go and give Y a kiss, or no, it's fine, or it's bad manners if they don't do it. But you're basically training them to override their own sense of what's right and what's wrong. And that is kind of like an ignoring of their consent, isn't it?
Definitely, you know, and you spoke about bodily autonomy, right? This is part of that. This is taking ownership of your body. And it's also, and this is not like a medical opinion, but teaching your mind to recognize when you yourself are uncomfortable with the situation and going by that instinct. Because we get so used to overriding that all the time and always going for the path of least resistance and keeping the peace, not making anyone uncomfortable. That's not something that's going to disappear overnight when you're an adult and suddenly you'll slap the person who harasses you on the street. Because you've been trained so often to go with the easy path. I mean, think of it this way. If I want to, conversations about money make us all uncomfortable. If I want to talk to my boss about a raise, I'm going to rehearse that in my mind in front of the mirror like 5 times, right? If I want to ask my parents for, I don't know, something that they're not usually, going out or maybe going out for a trip, going out of the city, something like that. I'm going to rehearse that 5 times over in my mind. Suddenly, if I'm in a situation where my bodily autonomy, my ownership of my body is being violated, people turn around and say, but why didn't you slap him? But why didn't you scream at him?
Why didn't you run?
I've been taught
why didn't you punch them? You're like, was nobody ever
in
taught
the
me
moment,
to do this?
These uncomfortable things don't come naturally to you. Why should we assume that suddenly you're an adult and you'll be able to do that?
But I think this is also something I'm thinking about, or how consent is also something that's fluid. That you could be okay with the situation on Monday, but if on Tuesday you're not okay with it anymore, that's okay too.
That's your right.
You can withdraw consent for something that you previously gave consent for.
And it's not even withdrawing. Every interaction is a fresh instance of consent.
Right.
So it's just because, like that tea example that we all watch on YouTube, just because I wanted tea on Monday doesn't mean I want tea every day or Wednesday or, whatever. It's every single time you want to offer me tea, you offer it to me as a fresh instance of consent, let's say.
No, and then that also means that in the middle of drinking the tea, if you don't feel like drinking it anymore, then you can leave the cup.
Yes. And that's retracting consent that was maybe on the way of being given, but before the finishing of the tea, you said, I don't want this anymore. And that is your right, and it must be respected.
But and I'm not just thinking about young people, but everybody, adults and young people, how do we get there? Because all of this seems like it requires a great deal of self-confidence and bravery, especially in cultures where there is so much emphasis on manners and being polite and not offending anybody, to be able to say that, I don't want this. Like, what are strategies that we can use? Are there any strategies? Like, what can we do to maybe train ourselves or help younger people or talk to kids a certain way to kind of encourage this conversation about what consent
I think that's what it is. You encourage the conversation. It's not something that you can teach people overnight. It's not a textbook, because if it was, then, everybody who's been saying things around the internet, it would not be saying those. It would be very easy to change mindsets. But these are mindsets, like we talked about, that have been entrenched and given to us over years and years of our culture and everything that we consume in our educational textbooks. Everything is a continuation and solidification of this mindset. So I think beginning at school, continuing into university, going into workplaces, talking to people about, it's a very small shift. Like you said, consent is a huge thing, but it's also a very simple thing. And when you start to recognize how simple it can be to just respect somebody's autonomy over their body, that's the switch that you need. And of course, there's a lot of baggage. The reason we don't respect it is because, again, it's objectification. It's that I know better for you than you know for yourself. That's the mindset that needs to change. I think it's a conversation upon conversation, building on from, so it's a lot of sensitization.
And, I also want to add, it's not like these concepts entirely don't exist in our culture.
Yes.
They do. They just have been glossed over because it's more convenient for the existing patriarchal structure to ignore them. You see that with the way a marriage is conducted, right? You need vocalized, understood consent by each of those people who are entering into that marriage. You have to say
and you have to
3 times over.
And 3 times indicates that you have fully understood.
Exactly. You can't be coerced into it. It's supposed to be a public undertaking so that it has all those witnesses and it is registered as being understood, etc., etc. This is why forced marriage is a crime, right? So consent does exist. Why can't we just not take that idea and extrapolate that into other areas of life as well?
Quite right, actually.
It's actually as simple as Hiba very poetically said, that's how it is.
And also, like, in spite of the fact that we know this, there will be forced marriages and there will be somebody being, like in films, where the evil, wicked aunt pushes the girl and she just kind of nods. And they're like, that's just implied consent because she nodded.
So it's misuse of power, right?
But that's exactly an example. That's things that we shouldn't be accepting because it, technically speaking and legally, it should be vocalized. You know, we should move on from this idea of simply nodding your head because she's too shy is yes, no, it's not.
No, it's not. And also the fact that silence also implies consent. In so many situations, if you stayed quiet because, again, you didn't know or you were afraid. And I'm just thinking of lots of situations in which somebody can just sort of get away with lots of things.
I think that's where eventually these things must fall onto the state. And it becomes very important to provide structures of safety for people who are trying to stand up for themselves. Because, like, you know, like the example of if somebody's being abused inside their home and that abuse is not being recognized by the adults around them, then where are they going to go? And it doesn't help them for us to go and tell them, but you have body autonomy and you can say no, you know? Because they don't have a state, they don't have state apparatus to rely on. And this is a very genuine problem.
Because then even if you are saying no and you are brave enough to say that this is not okay with me and the other person is not respecting your no, then that's where the state comes in then to help enforce that.
Yes.
So what have we got? Have we got any sort of apparatus that one can legally, you know, sort of...
that has to do with, number one, you know, the state having a criminal justice system in place that recognizes your ability, that's accessible, that is not some scary machinery that it is for all of us right now, where we don't want to go into a police station. We are scared of going to the courts. It's such an in-hospital bed environment. That needs to change. The criminal justice system needs to be accessible, needs to be easily understood. And then the second part of that also is... you know, welfare mechanisms, shelters and halfway houses that allow people, children frequently, who decide to walk out of an abusive situation, they need to have shelters to go to. They need to then have halfway houses as they transition from an emergency shelter into finding a job, going to school, education, transitioning into regular life. And that's something that there's no two ways about it. The state needs to step up to those responsibilities. You can pass the most strict laws, but you're not creating an enabling environment for people to assert their bodily autonomy, and violations will therefore continue to occur.
And access those laws. Right? So if nobody wants to go to a police station, then what difference does it make if there's, you know, there are 10 laws there? And the situation is better. Sorry, go ahead. The situation is better in the sense that, you know, we have that violence against women center in Multan, and we have, you know, these female...
And legislation is helping create this awareness also that this is a situation that's actually not okay at all. Like, a lot of times I think people don't realize that a situation is bad because it becomes normal for them.
That's all they know, right?
Now, one sort of aspect of consent that I'm thinking about, and Angbeen, because you are on the board of the Digital Rights Foundation, is also like consent for your image, for example. But I feel like a lot of people don't realize this, that random strangers can't take photos of you. It's not okay. Like, I do find that strangers would try to come and take photos of my children, for example. And I'd be like, you can't do that. And they meant well, that they're like, oh, a cute baby, can I have a photo? And like, no.
But they didn't ask you.
And that's sort of two-pronged consent, where they don't ask. And then there's also a child's consent here, where then as a parent, you have to protect their consent and be like, you can't use images of my child just...
Again, this is an extension, I think, of what we were talking about in our culture. We're like, oh, go and say, you know, go and hug this person. And the idea that somebody feels the ability to take a picture of a child and post it or whatever. And so now all of this is a crime, right? So the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act 2016, PICA, criminalizes usage of images without your consent, superimposition of your image on, you know, let's say nude pictures, whatever, without your consent, even taking a picture without your consent. So now, increasingly, when you'll go into a conference and somebody wants to take a picture of the conference, they'll just do a quick check to say, are you all okay with the fact that I'm taking a picture? And of course, these are informed people who are informed about the law sitting in these conferences, but this culture and this knowledge needs to be spread out to people around us, because like you said, you know, you take a foreign friend to the Lahore fort and this, you know, it
looks just, like somebody did.
It was humiliating for me, but it was like paparazzi galore, right? And at one point I stopped a person and said, what are you doing? And he just turned around and said, I'm taking a picture of you guys. And then the problem is that I'm not going to haul him into the police station as well, right? So it's a crime and that's fine, but like,
You have
But
to
like
understand
Hiba
that-
saying, all the laws in the world won't change the mindset.
Yeah, and this is why we have to keep having these conversations to sort of understand. Or if somebody takes your photo off the internet and uses it on their website,
Yes.
you can't do that.
Yes.
You're violating somebody's consent here.
And they do it with children most often, right? Yeah.
But also adults.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that too.
That's an extension of a violation of your bodily autonomy,
Yes.
right? It's your body. You have ownership of it. You decide what pictures you want out there.
Yeah.
It's not somebody else's business to be doing that.
Yeah, and there's often that idea that if somebody puts themselves out into the public sphere, then they are thereby open to whatever.
They're public property.
Yes.
But they're not.
Exactly.
Yes.
Which goes back to what were you wearing? Where were you at the time?
Yes.
It's objectification of anybody.
Yes.
And
the idea that you don't know your mind.
yes,
So
and
we
also
know
that
better for you.
it does. And again, it doesn't matter what you think. It only matters what I would like to do with this.
Yes.
Goodness. I know I'm sort of getting a point where I feel like I need to drink a glass of
I know,
water
right?
now.
And again, I'd just like to add that a big part of that is our own awareness of it, and our
Yes.
own awareness is important of its own, but also because it's people like you and me and people in this room who then become part of the state. And you can have Pika and you can have the best laws in the world, but if the guy sitting at the desk at the FIA just thinks this is not important and you're just being sensitive about it, all the best laws in the world amount to nothing.
Yes.
Which is why conversations by the bureaucracy, by our elected officials, they need to change. And the signaling around this needs to be more serious rather than thinking of it as just an issue that women make up.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Privileged women make up.
Privileged
yes.
makeup.
Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
again, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me today and all this wonderful conversation that we've had. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I think that we have been particularly successful in unpacking a lot of the sort of misinformation that we have about consent, and also about how consent exists in so many different shapes and forms, and to what extent do we need to know about consent to protect ourselves, but also when we learn about consent, we are able to protect others, and we are able to not get ourselves into situations, or we were able to manage situations whereby we're okay, for lack of a better term, is that you don't cause anybody else harm and they don't cause you harm. And this is how we all exist in a healthy, functional society. And that can only happen when we talk about consent and we talk about what it means to say yes or what it means to say no and how to respect each other. Thank you guys for watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time on The Coffee Table. Bye.